What really started the Second World War? Was it the ambition of one man who willed a conflict into existence? Was it the humiliation of an entire nation, ground into the dirt by a punishing peace treaty until its rage erupted into something monstrous? Was it the cowardice of statesmen who chose peace at any price, only to purchase the costliest war in human history? Or was it something deeper and harder to pin down, a civilizational failure, the unraveling of the international order that the First World War had already half destroyed? From the smoking ruins of 1918 to the grey dawn of September 1st, 1939, a chain of decisions, disasters, missed opportunities, and desperate gambles unfolded across 2 decades that made the Second World War not just possible, but in the minds of many historians, all but inevitable. And yet, nothing was truly inevitable. At every step along the way, there were moments when the catastrophe could have been averted, when different choices might have changed. Everything. Those moments passed one by one, squandered by ignorance, fear, selfishness, or sheer bad judgment, until there was nothing left to do but fight. In this video, we will find out exactly what started the deadliest conflict the world has ever seen. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. The story does not begin in 1939. It does not even begin in 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power and set Germany on its path to war. To understand how the Second World War began, you must go back to November 1918, to a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in northern France, where German representatives signed the armistice that ended the First World War. The two conflicts are inseparable. The peace that followed the Great War was not a real peace at all. It was, as the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch reportedly said when he first read its terms, not a peace, but an armistice for 20 years. He was accurate to within a matter of months. The documents signed at Versailles in June 1919 were, whether their authors knew it or not, writing the first chapter of the next catastrophe. Understanding why requires understanding what the First World War had done to Europe and what it had left behind. The First World War had been a disaster of almost incomprehensible scale. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had consumed roughly 17 million lives, military and civilian. Empires that had stood for centuries collapsed within months. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had dominated Central Europe since the medieval period, simply ceased to exist, replaced by a patchwork of small and often quarrelsome successor states. The Ottoman Empire, which had stretched from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf for 6 centuries, broke apart and withered into the rump of what became modern Turkey. The Russian Empire, one of the largest territorial empires in history, was swept away by revolution and replaced by the Soviet Union, a communist state that most of the capitalist world regarded with deep suspicion and outright hostility. Even the victors had been bled nearly white. Britain lost close to 1 million men killed, with the toll rising considerably when you counted the dead from Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, and the rest of the empire. France, which had suffered the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front, lost over 1.5 million of its sons. These were not abstractions or statistics. These were the husbands, brothers, fathers, and children of entire generations, and the nations that survived carried the weight of those losses into every decision they made in the years that followed. Germany, of course, had suffered too. Nearly 2 million German soldiers died in the fighting, and hundreds of thousands more were permanently disabled. The German army, which had been one of the most formidable military machines the world had ever seen, had been ground down through 4 years of brutal attrition by the Ain. Autumn of 1918, the situation was becoming untenable. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's final fortified defensive position on the Western Front, had been broken by the Allies in the 100 Days Offensive, a series of crushing assaults that began in August 1918 and drove the German army backward in disarray. American troops were arriving in France at the rate of approximately 10,000 men per day, an endless flood of fresh reinforcements that Germany could not match. The naval blockade had been strangling Germany's economy since 1914, and by 1918, ordinary German civilians were genuinely starving. Official statistics indicate that perhaps 300,000 Germans died from malnutrition and related diseases caused by the blockade during the war years. Revolution was not merely possible, but underway. In late October 1918, sailors mutinied at the German naval bases of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, refusing to put to sea for what they correctly understood would be a suicidal last battle. Workers' councils, directly inspired by the Russian Revolution of the previous year, seized power in Munich, Hamburg, Berlin, and other major cities. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9th and fled to the Netherlands, where he would live until 1941. On that same November 9th, a social democratic politician named Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed a German republic from a window of the Reichstag building in Berlin, reportedly without any prior planning, simply to prevent a communist republic from being proclaimed first. 2 days later, the armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent. Here is the crucial detail that would poison German politics for the next 15 years and prove one of the most destructive lies in the history of modern politics. When the armistice was signed, the German army had not been defeated on German soil. German troops still occupied large swathes of France and Belgium. No Allied army was marching through the Brandenburg Gate. There was no enemy soldier standing on the Rhine. From the perspective of millions of ordinary German soldiers and civilians, many of whom had endured 4 years of extraordinary hardship and had been told right up until the last weeks that Germany was fighting honourably and not losing, the surrender made no sense. The conclusion that suggested itself to those unwilling to accept the reality of military defeat was that Germany had been betrayed from within, stabbed in the back by traitors at home, by socialists, by pacifists, by Jews, by anyone other than the generals who had actually demanded the armistice. This was, of course, a lie. The German army had been beaten. Erich Ludendorff, the quartermaster general who had effectively commanded the German war effort for 2 years, had personally told the Kaiser in late September 1918 that the military situation was hopeless and that an armistice must be sought immediately. He had then had the breathtaking audacity to place the blame on the civilian government for following his own advice. The stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende as it became known in German, was born almost immediately after the armistice. Ludendorff promoted it aggressively. Right-wing newspapers and political parties embraced it. It spread through the German right like a virus, infecting an entire political culture with a foundational lie that no amount of evidence could dislodge, and it became the cornerstone of Adolf Hitler's political appeal. But before we get to Hitler, we must understand the world he walked into. The new German Republic, which history remembers as the Weimar Republic after the Thuringian city where its constitution was drafted in 1919, came into existence under the worst possible circumstances imaginable for a democratic experiment. It was born in defeat, in revolution, and in economic crisis. Its founders were men of genuine principle, moderate social democrats and liberals who believed in parliamentary democracy and wanted to build a decent, humane German state on the ruins of the empire, but they were immediately burdened with the consequences of a war they had not started and a defeat they had not caused, and their enemies on both the far right and the far left were merciless in exploiting this. The Weimar Republic's founders signed the armistice, and then they were forced to sign the peace treaty. In the minds of German nationalists, they would forever be the November criminals, the men who had surrendered, the traitors who had sold out the fatherland. It was a slander that would follow democratic politicians to their graves, in several cases, quite literally. What did the peace conference that assembled in Paris in early 1919 actually look like, and why did it produce such a disastrous result? It was unlike anything the world had seen before, a gathering of representatives from 32 nations trying simultaneously to settle the most destructive war in history, remake the maps of 3 continents, and build an international order that would prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The dominant figures were the so-called Big Four: President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each man came to Paris with a different vision, different domestic pressures and irreconcilable priorities. The compromises between them would ultimately satisfy nobody and store up grievances that would prove lethal. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris in December 1918 to a reception that was nothing short of extraordinary. Crowds lined the streets of Paris, London and Rome to greet him. People wept with joy. Flowers were thrown before his motorcade. He was hailed as the saviour of civilization, the prophet of a new world order, the man who had laid out a vision for the post-war world in his famous 14 points address to Congress in January 1918, Wilson's vision was idealistic and genuinely inspiring. He called for the self-determination of peoples, meaning that ethnic and national groups should have the right to govern themselves. He called for open diplomacy and the end of secret treaties. He demanded freedom of the seas and equal trading rights between nations. He wanted arms reductions by all powers. He called for a League of Nations, an international organization that would resolve disputes between countries through law and arbitration rather than war. It was on paper a vision of a world organized on principles of reason and justice rather than power and conquest, and the exhausted peoples of Europe wanted desperately to believe it was possible. But Wilson's idealism ran immediately into the hard walls of political reality. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister known as the Tiger, was 78 years old when the conference began and had lived through 2 German invasions of France in 1870 and 1914. He was not interested in idealism. When someone told him that God himself had needed only 10 commandments, Clemenceau reportedly replied that Wilson had come to Paris with 14 points, and let us see how that works out. He wanted Germany broken, permanently weakened, stripped of the capacity to wage offensive war, and made to pay for the devastation it had inflicted. France's northern industrial regions, the most productive part of the French economy, had been fought over for 4 years and left in a state of utter ruin. The coal mines of the Nord had been deliberately flooded by retreating German forces. Thousands of square miles of French farmland were pockmarked with shell craters and poisoned with unexploded ordnance. Over 1.5 million French soldiers were dead. Clemenceau's entire political mandate was to ensure that this never happened again, and if you understood France's position and France's suffering, you could see why he thought as he did. And yet the peace he helped craft would make a repeat more, not less, likely. Lloyd George of Britain occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. He was, privately, more sympathetic to Germany than Clemenceau, and more realistic about the long-term consequences of a punitive peace. He once wrote a memorandum arguing that an unduly harsh settlement would produce a dangerous reaction in Germany and plant the seeds of future conflict. But he was also a prisoner of British public opinion, which had been inflamed by years of wartime propaganda and had just returned a government at the December 1918 election on promises of hanging the Kaiser and making Germany pay. Newspapers had promised that Germany would be squeezed until the pips squeaked. Lloyd George's instinct was for a somewhat more moderate settlement, but his room for manoeuvre was severely constrained by what British voters expected and demanded. He tried at various points to restrain Clemenceau's more extreme demands, but he ultimately conceded far more than he should have on crucial points. Vittorio Orlando of Italy was in a different and particularly bitter position. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the Allied side, having initially declared neutrality and then negotiated its entry in exchange for a package of territorial promises made in the secret Treaty of London. Italy was promised, among other things, territory in Dalmatia, parts of the eastern Adriatic coast, and colonial gains in Africa and elsewhere. At Paris, Wilson insisted that the principle of self-determination, which was hard enough to apply consistently elsewhere, must override these pre-war promises in the case of the Dalmatian coast, much of whose population was Slavic rather than Italian. Orlando walked out of the conference in protest. He returned to Rome empty-handed to face a political crisis that would, within a few years, help bring Benito Mussolini to power. The Italian sense of having been cheated, of having sacrificed 600,000 dead to be denied the fruits of victory at the peace table, of having won the war only to lose the peace, created the political conditions for fascism. It was a pattern that would repeat itself. The Treaty of Versailles, finally signed on June 28, 1919, in the magnificent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, was received in Germany with shock, fury, and humiliation. The date, June 28th, was chosen deliberately. It was exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the event that had set the First World War in motion. The German peace delegation, which had gone to Paris expecting to negotiate a treaty based on Wilson's 14 points, and had instead been presented with a document and told to sign it or face renewed war, was scandalized. The terms were severe on almost every front. Germany lost approximately 13% of its pre-war territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine, the 2 eastern French provinces that Germany had seized in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, were returned to France. The Rhineland, German territory west of the Rhine, and a strip extending 50 kilometers east of the river, was to be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years and permanently demilitarized thereafter. The Saar region, with its valuable coalfields, was placed under League of Nations administration for 15 years, with coal revenues going to France as compensation for the deliberate flooding of French mines by retreating German forces. Further territorial losses cut into the east of Germany in ways that seemed particularly unjust to German nationalists, even when they could be justified on ethnic grounds. Poland, which had been partitioned out of existence between Russia, Prussia and Austria in the 1790s, was reconstituted as a sovereign state. To give Poland access to the sea, a strip of territory called the Polish Corridor was created, running from central Poland to the Baltic coast. This corridor separated the German province of East Prussia from the rest of Germany, cutting through what had been German-inhabited territory for centuries. The predominantly German-speaking port city of Danzig at the mouth of the Vistula River was made a free city under League of Nations protection, associated economically with Poland, but outside both German and Polish sovereignty. Germany also lost the Memel territory on the Lithuanian border, the northern part of Schleswig to Denmark after a plebiscite, and the territories of Eupen and Malmedy to Belgium. Altogether, Germany lost all of its overseas colonies, which were distributed among the Allied powers as mandates under the League of Nations, a distinction that made little practical difference to those who received them. The military terms were designed to ensure Germany's permanent second-class status in terms of armed force. The German army was limited to 100,000 long-service volunteers, specifically structured to prevent the creation of a mass reserve force. There was to be no German air force whatsoever. The navy was reduced to 6 battleships, 6 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats, with no ships over 10,000 tons displacement and an explicit prohibition on submarines, the weapon that had come closest to winning the war for Germany. The General Staff, which had been the intellectual backbone of the German military, was dissolved. Military schools and academies were restricted. The heavily fortified naval base at Heligoland was demolished. Germany was to be, permanently and by treaty, a military second-rate power, unable to defend itself against any of its larger neighbours. This was, for a nation with one of the proudest military traditions in Europe, an almost inconceivable humiliation. But the provision that proved most politically explosive of all, the clause that would haunt European politics for the next 20 years and provide the central rhetorical weapon of every German nationalist, was Article 231 of the treaty, the so-called War Guilt Clause. This single paragraph, written into the treaty as the legal foundation for the reparations demands that followed, required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals had been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Germany alone was declared guilty. The catastrophe that had consumed 4 years and 17 million lives was laid entirely at Germany's door. The reaction in Germany was one of unified outrage that crossed every political line. The Social Democrats who ran the government, the nationalists on the far right, the communists on the far left, the Catholics, the liberals, almost everyone agreed that the War Guilt Clause was both a factual lie and a moral obscenity. The German foreign minister who led the delegation to Paris, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, delivered his response seated, deliberately refusing to stand as was traditional, a gesture of contemptuous protest. He argued at length that Germany was not the sole author of the catastrophe, that the system of rival alliances, the arms race, the imperial ambitions of all the great powers, including Russia, Austria, Hungary and Serbia, had combined to produce the war. He was not entirely wrong. But his protests changed nothing. Germany could accept the treaty or face renewed hostilities. Germany signed. The Reparations Bill took 2 years to calculate. When the final figure was announced by the Reparations Commission in May 1921, it stood at 132 billion gold marks, a number so large that it defied comprehension. Whether Germany could actually pay this was immediately and bitterly contested. The most famous critique came from John Maynard Keynes, a young Cambridge economist who had been part of the British Treasury delegation at Paris and had resigned in protest at the proceedings. His book, published in 1919 and titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace, was a brilliant, polemical and extraordinarily influential dissection of what the treaty would do to the European economy. Keynes argued that the reparations demands were not just economically unrealistic, asking Germany to pay sums that would require decades of export surpluses and would depress the entire European economy in the process, but were morally indefensible and would produce exactly the political backlash that rational statesmen should fear. He described the conference as a catastrophe for civilization, and Wilson as a man who had been outmaneuvered and betrayed at every turn by his more cynical European partners. The book became an international bestseller and shaped educated opinion in Britain and the United States for the entire interwar period. It fed a growing and quite widespread conviction in both countries that Germany had been treated unjustly at Versailles and that some revision of the treaty terms was both fair and necessary. This guilt about the peace settlement, this sympathy for Germany's position, would have enormous consequences in the 1930s, when revision was no longer a matter of diplomatic negotiation, but of responding to Hitler's demands at gunpoint. The Weimar Republic staggered into existence carrying all these burdens and faced enemies from every direction almost immediately. The Republic's founders were men trying to build a democracy under conditions that would have been difficult enough in peacetime and were very nearly impossible under the combined weight of military defeat, a punitive peace treaty, economic chaos, and violent opposition from both extremes of the political spectrum. In January 1919, even before the peace treaty was signed, a communist uprising in Berlin, the Spartacist revolt led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, was suppressed by the government using irregular right-wing paramilitary units called the Freikorps. Luxemburg and Liebknecht were both murdered by their captors, their bodies dumped in a Berlin canal. The episode established a grim precedent, the democratic government relying on right-wing militias to maintain order, creating a debt that the right would use to justify its contempt for the Republic. The Freikorps men who killed Luxemburg and Liebknecht felt no loyalty to the Republic they served. They despised it. They were simply killing communists, which they would have done for any employer. The early years of the Republic were punctuated by crisis after crisis. In March 1920, a right-wing coup known as the Kapp Putsch, led by a Prussian civil servant named Wolfgang Kapp and supported by parts of the military, seized Berlin for 4 days, forcing the legitimate government to flee. The coup collapsed not because of any military counteraction, but because of a general strike called by the trade unions, which simply paralyzed the country. The episode revealed both the fragility of the Republic's foundations, a significant portion of its own army refusing to resist the putsch, and also the countervailing strength of organized German labor. It showed that the Republic had enemies in high places, but also genuine defenders among the German working class. A series of political assassinations followed. Matthias Erzberger, the Centre Party politician who had signed the armistice and was accordingly vilified by the right, was shot dead by right-wing extremists in August 1921. Walter Rathenau, the Jewish foreign minister whose Rapallo treaty with Soviet Russia had been a rare diplomatic success for the Republic, was assassinated in June 1922, again by right-wing killers. The message these murders sent was unmistakable. Democratic politicians in the Weimar Republic served their country at personal risk, but the greatest immediate threat to the Republic's survival came not from bullets but from the printing press. The economic consequences of the war, the reparations burden, the costs of reconstruction, the disruption of Germany's pre-war trade relationships, and the underlying fiscal devastation left by 4 years of total war, all combined to produce one of the most extraordinary episodes of inflation in economic history. The German government's response to its fiscal problems was to print money, and by 1921 this had produced significant inflation. The French occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923, when Germany fell behind on reparations payments and France sent troops to occupy Germany's industrial heartland to extract payment directly, triggered an economic crisis that turned severe inflation into hyperinflation of genuinely catastrophic proportions. The German government called for passive resistance in the Ruhr, encouraging workers and managers to simply stop cooperating with the French occupiers, and financed this resistance by printing money on an ever-accelerating scale. By the summer of 1923, prices were rising daily, then hourly. By November 1923, the exchange rate had reached 4 trillion, 200 billion marks to $1. That figure deserves a moment to sit with. 4 trillion, 200 billion marks to $1. Workers were paid twice a day and given time off to spend their wages before they lost their value entirely. A wheelbarrow full of banknotes might not buy a loaf of bread. People burned banknotes in their stoves because the paper had more value as fuel than as currency. The savings of the German middle class, built over lifetimes of thrift and careful financial planning, were wiped out completely overnight. A retired schoolteacher who had put away enough in the bank to live comfortably found herself penniless. A businessman who had loaned money found that when it was repaid in increasingly worthless marks, he could not even buy a meal with the sum. The psychological and political impact of this catastrophe, particularly on the middle classes, was profound and lasting. People who had played by the rules of the economic system, who had been industrious and prudent, had been utterly ruined not once, but effectively twice. First by the war, and then by the inflation. And they were desperately looking for someone to blame. It was in this toxic atmosphere of defeat, humiliation, economic chaos, and political violence that Adolf Hitler made his first serious bid for national attention. Born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the border with Bavaria, Hitler had led an undistinguished early life. His father Alois was a customs official, a respectable if unexceptional career, and the family was neither wealthy nor connected. Young Adolf showed some artistic ambition and dreamed of becoming a painter or architect, but he was rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, a failure that left a deep wound in his personality and perhaps fed the grudge against the educated establishment that he would nurse his entire life. He spent several years drifting in Vienna, living in men's hostels, selling postcards and small paintings to furniture dealers, absorbing the turbulent political culture of a city where radical German nationalism and virulent anti-Semitism were not fringe positions but mainstream political forces. Vienna under Karl Lueger, the populist anti-Semitic mayor who held office from 1897 to 1910, was a city where racist politics were in the air that everyone breathed. Hitler breathed it deeply and made it central to his worldview. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Hitler, who had been living in Munich for 2 years and had been avoiding Austrian military service, enlisted in the Bavarian army with what appears to have been genuine, even joyful enthusiasm. The war gave his directionless life a structure and purpose it had never had before. He served as a regimental dispatch runner, a dangerous job that required moving messages through shell-torn territory and that exposed him repeatedly to the worst of the fighting on the Western Front at Ypres, the Somme, Arras and Passchendaele. He was wounded twice, badly enough on the second occasion in October 1916 to require a lengthy hospitalization. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914, and more unusually for an enlisted man, the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, for an act of individual bravery. He genuinely appears to have loved army life, the camaraderie, the structure, the sense of shared purpose. He would later describe the years of the First World War as the greatest and most unforgettable time of his life, a statement that is not just disturbing but illuminating about the kind of man he was. When the armistice came in November 1918, Hitler was in a military hospital at Pasewalk, north of Berlin, temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack and recovering slowly. He later claimed that when a pastor visited the ward to inform the patients of Germany's surrender and the Kaiser's abdication, he was so overcome with grief and rage that his sight temporarily returned as the full horror of the news hit him. He went back to his bunk, pulled the blanket over his head and wept for the first time since his mother's death. Whether or not this account is entirely accurate in its details, there is no question that the experience of Germany's defeat was transformative for Hitler. It confirmed and intensified all his existing hatreds and gave them a political focus. The Jews and the Marxists had stabbed Germany in the back. The politicians who had signed the armistice were traitors. The peace treaty was a crime against the German people. Everything that had happened was the fault of Germany's enemies within, and a strong leader would put things right. This was the core of the political message Hitler would refine and sell for the next 15 years. After the war, Hitler stayed in the Bavarian army, which used him initially as an informer and political educator, monitoring the numerous radical political groups proliferating in Munich's turbulent post-war atmosphere. In September 1919, he was sent to observe a meeting of a tiny group called the German Workers' Party. He ended up in an argument with another attendee and, in the process, discovered something that appears to have genuinely surprised him. He had a remarkable talent for political oratory. He joined the party, became its most important speaker, and within months was effectively its leader. By July 1921, having manoeuvred the party's nominal founders out of authority, he was the undisputed chief of what had been renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, which would come to be known to the world by the abbreviation of one word in its name: Nazi. Hitler's political meetings in Munich's beer halls attracted growing crowds through 1921 and 1922. His rhetorical style was unlike anything German politics had seen before, a raw, visceral, emotionally overwhelming performance that, built from quiet beginnings through gathering intensity to thundering climaxes, hitting the precise notes of grievance, pride, and burning resentment that resonated with his audiences. He was not a systematic thinker or a coherent ideologist in any academic sense, but he had a politician's instinct for what his audience felt and feared and wanted, and he was able to give those feelings an outlet, a narrative, and a direction. The Weimar Republic had stabbed Germany in the back. The Jews were behind everything evil. Germany would be great again. These were simple messages, but in the Munich of 1922, for people who were watching their savings become worthless and their country seemed to be disintegrating, they were powerful ones. The beer hall putsch of November 8th and 9th, 1923, was Hitler's first attempt to seize power. Taking inspiration from Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year, which had successfully intimidated the Italian government into surrendering power, Hitler attempted to launch a revolution from Munich that he hoped would spread across Germany and bring down the Weimar Republic. On the evening of November 8th, with the help of the World War I General Erich Ludendorff, he disrupted a meeting of Bavarian political and military leaders at the Bürgerbräukeller, a large Munich beer hall, fired a pistol into the ceiling, and announced that the national revolution had begun. The plan was for the Munich putsch to serve as the trigger for a nationwide uprising, but it collapsed almost immediately when the Bavarian state government and military, which had initially appeared to cooperate under duress, withdrew their support. On the morning of November 9th, a column of about 2,000 Nazi demonstrators attempted to march through Munich toward the state government buildings and was met by police who opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed in the brief exchange of shots. Hitler, marching in the front row, was knocked down and dislocated his shoulder when the man next to him was shot. He fled the scene, was arrested 2 days later, and was put on trial for treason. The trial was Hitler's first major national platform, and he used it brilliantly. Rather than defending himself, he turned the proceedings into an indictment of the government and the Weimar Republic. He spoke of his patriotic motives, his love of Germany, his determination to save the country from its enemies within and without. The sympathetic judges gave him only the minimum sentence for high treason, 5 years, and he was released after serving only 9 months at Landsberg prison. But those 9 months were not wasted. In the relative comfort of his cell, dictating to his deputy Rudolf Hess, Hitler produced the first volume of Mein Kampf, his combined autobiography and political manifesto, published in 1925. The book is verbose, repetitive, and filled with crude racial theories that any careful reader could have recognized as the ideological framework for genocide. It laid out with remarkable clarity the goals Hitler intended to pursue: the destruction of Marxism and what he called Jewish Bolshevism, the acquisition of Lebensraum or living space for the German people in Eastern Europe, specifically the Soviet Union, the racial restructuring of Europe through the persecution and elimination of the Jewish population, and the establishment of a German empire that would dominate the continent. Any person who read Mein Kampf with careful attention in 1925 or 1926 would have known exactly what Hitler intended to do if he ever came to power. The tragedy is that most people did not read it carefully. Those who did often did not believe it, and those who believed it frequently did not think he could ever actually come to power. The mid-1920s were, in retrospect, the Weimar Republic's best years. The hyperinflation was brought under control by a currency reform in November 1923, with the introduction of the Rentenmark, pegged to agricultural land values. The Dawes Plan of 1924, negotiated with American involvement under Charles Dawes, reorganized Germany's reparations payments, reduced the immediate burden, and opened the door to a flood of American investment and loans that helped stabilize the German economy. The Locarno Treaties of October 1925 appeared to normalize Germany's position in Europe, with Germany accepting its western borders as permanent and with Britain and Italy guaranteeing those borders. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in September 1926, a symbolic acceptance of the country's return to the community of civilized nations. The foreign minister who negotiated these achievements, Gustav Stresemann, was genuinely skillful and received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926. He shared it with his French counterpart, Aristide Briand, and the two of them seemed to embody the possibility of a new Franco-German reconciliation that might make Europe peaceful and prosperous. The cultural life of the Weimar Republic during this period was genuinely extraordinary. Berlin became one of the cultural capitals of the world, a city of remarkable creative energy and social freedom, where German Expressionism, the Bauhaus School of Design, the experimental theatre of Bertolt Brecht, the cinema of Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, and the cabaret culture satirized by Christopher Isherwood in his Berlin Stories all flourished simultaneously. The Berlin of the late 1920s was, in certain respects, one of the most free and vibrant cities in human history. But it was also a city where street fights between communists and Nazis were a weekly occurrence, where the political situation could turn volatile in hours, and where the prosperity was largely dependent on American loans that could be called back at any time. Beneath the gleaming surface of Weimar culture, the wounds of defeat and economic crisis had not healed. They had merely been covered over and not very thick. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 ripped that cover away. The collapse of the American stock market triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in the history of capitalism, and its effects spread across the Atlantic with terrifying speed. American banks and investors facing losses at home called in their loans to Germany and stopped making new ones. German banks, dependent on that American credit, collapsed. German industry contracted violently as credit dried up and demand fell. Unemployment, which had been about 1.3 million in 1929, climbed to 3 million by 1930, to 4.4 million by early 1931, and to over 6 million by the beginning of 1932. But even those horrifying numbers do not capture the full extent of the suffering, because they do not count the millions of workers on short hours, the self-employed whose incomes had collapsed, the farmers unable to sell their produce at prices that covered their costs, the small businessmen going bankrupt week after week, the middle class. Families watching their savings erode for the second time in a decade. Germany's national income fell by nearly a third between 1929 and 1932. An industrial economy that had been recovering strongly was suddenly fighting for its life. In this catastrophe, the Nazi Party found its moment. The correlation between the Depression's severity and Nazi electoral performance is almost perfectly precise. In the Reichstag elections of May 1928, before the Depression had hit, the Nazis won only 2.6% of the vote and 12 seats. They were a fringe party. A year after the crash in the September 1930 elections, they won 18.3% of the vote and 107 seats, becoming overnight the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they won 37.4%, the highest share they would ever achieve in a genuinely free election, and became by far the largest party in Parliament. In 4 years, they had gone from marginal to dominant, carried there by the anger, fear, and despair of millions of Germans who had tried the moderate parties and found them incapable of addressing the crisis. What was Hitler actually offering that proved so attractive to so many? The answers are complex and have been debated intensively by historians, but several elements stand out. First, and most importantly, he was offering emotional release and a clear narrative of blame. The Depression had happened because of the Jews, the Marxists, the foreign powers, the November criminals who had betrayed Germany. This was not true, but it was emotionally satisfying in a way that the moderate party's complicated explanations of credit markets and international trade imbalances could not match. Second, he was offering spectacle and belonging. The Nazi movement was not just a political party, but a total community, with its own symbols, rituals, uniforms, songs, and mass events. The Nuremberg rallies, the torchlight processions through German streets, the ranks of uniformed men. Marching in perfect order, all of this offered a sense of pride, purpose, and belonging to people who felt humiliated and lost. Third, he was offering specific solutions, or at least specific promises. Tear up Versailles, rearm Germany, smash the communists, put Germany back to work. These were simple, powerful commitments in a time when the moderate parties seemed paralyzed and ineffectual. And fourth, for many members of the German middle class and business community, Hitler represented the lesser evil compared to the communists, who were also growing rapidly and who genuinely threatened the existing social and economic order. Better Hitler than Stalin was a calculation that many Germans made, disastrously. The path from electoral dominance to actual power ran through the back rooms of the German establishment, through the intrigues of conservative politicians, military officers, and industrialists who convinced themselves that they could use the Nazi movement without being used by it. By late 1932, Germany was in a genuine constitutional crisis. No stable coalition government was possible in the Reichstag. Chancellor after chancellor governed by emergency decree under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed the president to rule by executive order in times of national emergency. This provision, intended for genuine crises, was now being used routinely to maintain any semblance of governmental function. The Republic was, in essence, already operating in a quasi-dictatorial mode, which made the Nazi argument that democracy was a failure seem partially self-fulfilling. Paul von Hindenburg, the 84-year-old field marshal who had been elected president of Germany in 1925, was the crucial figure. He detested Hitler and had refused twice in 1932 to appoint him chancellor, reportedly calling him a bohemian corporal and a tiresome fellow. But in November and December 1932, a group of conservative advisers around Hindenburg, most notably the former, Chancellor Franz von Papen, who had grandiose political ambitions of his own, convinced the old man that the situation was desperate enough to warrant bringing Hitler into government on conservative terms. Their argument was that Hitler's popular support could be harnessed while his radicalism was constrained by surrounding him with conservative ministers in key positions. Papen famously told a colleague that within 2 months they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he would squeak. Von Papen would spend the rest of his long life either denying that he had said this or explaining why it had been a reasonable calculation. On January 30th, 1933, Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The Conservatives believed they had domesticated a dangerous but useful force. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the Conservatives learned what they had done. The Reichstag fire of February 27, 1933, whether it was started by the young Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe, who was arrested at the scene and later executed, or whether it was a Nazi provocation, as many historians have suspected, gave Hitler the pretext he needed to move against his opponents. The Reichstag fire decree of the following day suspended virtually all civil liberties, abolished freedom of the press, and authorized the arrest of political opponents without charge. Thousands of communists, social democrats, and trade union leaders were arrested in the days that followed. The Reichstag elections of March 5th, held in an atmosphere of intimidation and violence, gave the Nazis 43.9% of the vote, still not an absolute majority, but enough combined with the German nationalists and the exclusion of the arrested communist deputies to push through the Enabling Act on March 23, 1933. This law gave Hitler the power to rule by decree for 4 years without consulting the Reichstag. German democracy ended not with a bang but with a parliamentary vote in which representatives either raised their hands in approval under duress or, like the Social Democrats who courageously voted against it, knowing it was futile, delivered their last act of democratic defiance before being arrested or forced into exile. The months that followed saw the systematic dismantling of every institution that might have served as a check on Nazi power. Trade unions were dissolved in May 1933, their offices seized and their leaders arrested. Political parties were banned or dissolved themselves under pressure. The Social Democrats were formally banned in June. The Nationalists, who had been Hitler's coalition partners, dissolved themselves in June as well. The Catholic Centre Party, the oldest political party in Germany, voted to dissolve itself on July 5, 1933. By July 14th, the Nazi Party was formally declared the only legal political party in Germany. The process known as Gleichschaltung, the coordination or bringing into line of all German institutions, proceeded, At blinding speed, state governments were dissolved and replaced by Nazi-appointed Reich governors. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. The press was brought under the control of Joseph Goebbels's new Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The universities were purged of Jewish professors and political dissidents, driving out of Germany in a single year much of the finest academic talent in the world, including Albert Einstein, who was already in the United States when Hitler came to power and chose not to return. The judiciary was restructured to ensure that Nazi political and racial goals could be implemented through a system of legal forms without any independent judicial restraint. How did the outside world respond to all this? The reactions were mixed, often poorly informed, and frequently shaped by wishful thinking. In Britain, the dominant initial response was a combination of anxiety and a determination not to overreact. There was a widespread feeling, particularly in the political and intellectual classes, that Germany had legitimate grievances rooted in the injustice of Versailles, and that a German government which addressed those grievances might actually contribute to European stability rather than threatening it. Some conservative politicians and journalists were initially quite favourably impressed by Hitler, seeing him as a strong nationalist leader who was rescuing Germany from economic chaos and communist subversion. The Times of London, Britain's most prestigious newspaper, was broadly sympathetic to Germany for most of the 1930s and consistently argued for accommodation. Lord Halifax, who would later become Foreign Secretary, visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden in November 1937 and came away with a largely positive impression, describing him as a man who had achieved a great deal for his country and whose concerns about Versailles deserved to be addressed. This sympathy for Germany was not entirely irrational in the early 1930s. The argument that the peace of 1919 had been too harsh and that some of its provisions should be revised was genuinely reasonable. If Hitler's demands could be met within a framework of negotiation, if the legitimate aspirations of German nationalism could be accommodated peacefully, then a stable European order might be built. The problem, and it was a fundamental problem, was that this analysis completely misread the nature of Hitler's ambitions. He was not interested in addressing Versailles. He intended to conquer Europe. But this was not obvious to observers in 1933 or even 1935, because Hitler was at that stage careful to frame his demands in the language of national self-determination and reasonable grievance. The systematic murder and terror of the Nazi state was kept, as much as possible, within Germany's borders. The international community saw selective evidence of what was happening. In France, the response was a mixture of deep anxiety and political paralysis. The French had less illusion about Hitler's intentions than the British, partly because France was more immediately threatened, and partly because French military intelligence was better informed about German rearmament. But France was deeply divided internally, with a governing coalition of the left, the Popular Front, fighting against a nationalist right that in some quarters sympathized more with fascism than with the republic it nominally served. The slogan on the French right, "Better Hitler than Léon Blum," referring to France's socialist prime minister, captured a political pathology that crippled French strategic decision-making throughout the decade. France could not form a coherent policy because its political class was so bitterly divided that basic questions of national defense became hostages to domestic factional warfare. The United States, under Franklin Roosevelt from March 1933, was constrained by powerful isolationist currents in public opinion and in Congress. The American experience of the First World War had left a deep scar. Congressional investigations in the mid-1930s, particularly the Nye Committee hearings of 1934 to 1936, promoted the narrative that American entry into the war had been engineered by arms manufacturers and bankers who wanted to protect their loans to Britain and France, and that American boys had died to protect the profits of munitions makers. Whether or not this was accurate, it was politically powerful, and it produced a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937 that prohibited arms sales to belligerents, restricted American loans to warring countries, and attempted to keep the United States from being drawn into another European conflict. Roosevelt himself had a clearer understanding of the dangers than most American politicians, and his instinct was to involve the United States as a counterweight to the growing power of Germany and Japan. But he was a political realist who understood what, Public opinion would and would not support, and he had to move very carefully, very slowly, trying to educate the public about the dangers without getting too far ahead of what they were prepared to accept. The Soviet Union under Stalin was focused primarily on the internal transformation and terror of the early five-year plans, which were simultaneously industrializing the country at breakneck speed and killing millions of people through forced collectivization of agriculture. Stalin viewed Nazi Germany warily and recognized, earlier than many Western statesmen, that Hitler represented a mortal danger. In the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union made genuine overtures toward collective security, joining the League of Nations in 1934, entering mutual assistance treaties with France and Czechoslovakia in 1935, and instructing the Comintern to adopt a Popular Front policy of cooperation with social democratic and liberal parties against fascism. But Soviet overtures were met with consistent suspicion and ambivalence in London and Paris, partly because Western governments feared and distrusted communism, at least as deeply as they feared fascism, and partly because the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938, in which Stalin executed or imprisoned most of the Red Army's senior officer corps in a paroxysm of paranoid terror, had devastated perceptions of Soviet military capability. The wholesale killing of roughly 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders, seemed to indicate that the Soviet military machine was, at least in the short term, a broken instrument. This perception, which was at least partly correct, contributed to British and French reluctance to build the Soviet alliance that might have deterred Hitler. Japan's descent into militarist imperialism provided an early and crucial demonstration of how the international community would respond to aggression. Japanese militarism had been growing for decades, fueled by aggressive nationalism, resentment of Western economic and diplomatic dominance, and a belief in Japan's divine destiny to lead Asia. In September 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, acting without authorization from the Tokyo government, staged an incident at Mukden, blowing up a section of the South Manchurian Railway and blaming it on Chinese saboteurs. This manufactured pretext was used to justify the occupation of the entire province of Manchuria, which had a population of 30 million people. The Manchurian Incident, as it was known, revealed in stark terms what would happen when a major power decided to disregard international law and League of Nations norms. The League commissioned an investigation under Lord Lytton, which eventually produced a report condemning Japan's actions and calling for Manchuria's restoration to Chinese sovereignty. The League accepted the report. Japan resigned from the League, kept Manchuria, and renamed it Manchukuo. Nothing happened. No military action was taken or seriously contemplated. The lesson was unmistakable and was not lost on Hitler or Mussolini. The great democracies would talk, investigate, and condemn. They would not fight. Italy under Benito Mussolini had been the original template for European fascism. Mussolini had come to power in October 1922, threatening a march on Rome by his black shirt militia and being appointed Prime Minister by King Victor Emmanuel III, who calculated that offering Mussolini power was less dangerous than resisting him militarily. Over the following years, Mussolini had dismantled Italian democracy systematically, banning opposition parties, suppressing the free press, establishing a secret police, and creating the corporate state he promoted as a third way between capitalism and communism. He had been an important early inspiration for Hitler, who had admired Mussolini long before the Germans' own rise to power, and had in the early years of their relationship occupied something of a junior position relative to the Italian dictator. By the mid-1930s, however, the relationship was shifting. Germany's rapidly growing power was beginning to make Italy's position in the relationship more dependent, a shift that Mussolini found uncomfortable but could not reverse. Mussolini's imperial ambitions centered on building an Italian empire in Africa, specifically the conquest of Ethiopia, one of the last remaining independent African states and a country that had famously defeated an Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, an embarrassment that Italian nationalists had never forgotten. In October 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from Eritrea and Somaliland with a modern army of approximately 300,000 men, equipped with artillery, aircraft, and chemical weapons. The Ethiopians, led by Emperor Haile Selassie, fought back with extraordinary courage, but their rifles and traditional, Weapons were no match for Italian tanks and mustard gas, which Mussolini authorized the use of in violation of international law. Haile Selassie addressed the League of Nations in June 1936 in a speech of great dignity and eloquence, appealing to the world's conscience and warning that if Ethiopia fell, other states would follow. He was right, but his appeal produced only moral sympathy and limited practical action. The League imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but Britain and France, both fearing that too severe sanctions would push Mussolini into Hitler's arms, deliberately excluded oil from the list, and without the ability to cut off Italy's fuel supply, the sanctions were largely ineffective. Ethiopia was conquered by May 1936. The League of Nations had failed its second major test after Manchuria. Its authority was effectively destroyed. The Ethiopian crisis was also a pivotal moment in the alignment of the fascist powers. Britain and France's half-hearted sanctions drove Mussolini away from his cautious association with the Western democracies and toward Germany. In October 1936, Hitler and Mussolini announced the Rome-Berlin Axis, a political partnership that declared their shared values and shared opposition to the existing international order. The same month, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, directed nominally against Communist International, but in reality a statement of ideological and strategic solidarity. Italy would join the pact in November 1937, completing the triangle that was known as the Axis powers. Hitler now had Mussolini in his corner, and Mussolini's earlier willingness to defend Austrian independence, demonstrated when he mobilized troops on the Brenner Pass after the failed 1934 Austrian coup, had been dissolved by the Ethiopian War and the sanctions crisis. The way to Austria was open. German rearmament had been proceeding secretly since the early years of the Nazi regime, violating the Treaty of Versailles before, the first openly illegal move in 1935. The secret rearmament had been facilitated by the connivance of parts of the old German military establishment, which had maintained illegal weapons programs and training schemes through front organizations and arrangements with the Soviet Union throughout the 1920s, when German and Soviet interests in evading the Versailles restrictions had aligned. When Hitler came to power, this secret rearmament was enormously accelerated. In March 1935, Hitler openly announced the existence of a new German air force, the Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, acknowledging what had been a secret for several years. He also announced the reintroduction of compulsory military service, with a target of building the German army to 36 divisions and 500,000 men. These were direct, open, unambiguous violations of the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France protested. Britain, France and Italy met at Stresa in April 1935 and issued a joint condemnation of German unilateral treaty violations, the so-called Stresa Front. And then, in June 1935, Britain unilaterally and bilaterally signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which formally accepted German naval rearmament in exchange for a German promise to limit its fleet to 35% of British naval strength and 45% in the case of submarines, the weapons that had nearly won the war for Germany. The French, who had not been consulted, were furious. The Stresa Front had lasted exactly 2 months. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement was one of the most short-sighted acts of interwar British diplomacy. It sent an unmistakable signal to Hitler and to the world. Britain would accommodate German violations of Versailles rather than resist them. It was a green light, wrapped in the language of bilateral arrangements, for the ongoing German rearmament program. It confirmed that the Treaty of Versailles was a dead letter, that its military restrictions could be ignored, and that Britain would cut bilateral deals that undermined Allied solidarity rather than enforce the collective security provisions of the treaty. Hitler noted the lesson and acted on it. The remilitarization of the Rhineland on March 7, 1936, was the most dangerous gamble of Hitler's entire pre-war career, and the moment when the Second World War might most easily have been prevented. Under the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Treaties of 1925, the Rhineland, German territory extending approximately 50 kilometers east of the Rhine River, was permanently demilitarized. No German troops were permitted there. This was France's essential security guarantee, the strip of German territory that French forces could occupy at the first sign of German aggression, and whose demilitarized status meant that France would have strategic warning and operational space before any German attack on its borders. In the early hours of March 7th, 1936, approximately 22,000 German troops, supported by a handful of aircraft, entered the demilitarized zone and occupied it. Hitler had given his military commanders secret orders. If French forces moved to resist, the German troops were to retreat immediately. The generals were terrified. They later told him that if the French had marched, the operation would have had to be abandoned, and the political consequences for the regime might have been fatal. But the French did not march. The French government was in the middle of a political crisis. The foreign minister was ill. The military was cautious and overestimated German strength, and Britain made absolutely clear that it would not support military action. The British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden told the French privately that Britain would not go to war over what he described as Hitler marching into his own backyard. The crisis passed in a matter of days. Hitler had gambled everything on a bluff and won. His contempt for the Western democracies deepened into something like certainty. He told his inner circle afterward that he had been the only one who had believed they would not act. He had been right. Germany was now free to build fortifications on the Rhine, to develop the defences that would protect Germany's western flank while it dealt with the east, and to plan the expansionist programme that Mein Kampf had laid out a decade earlier. The Spanish Civil War added another dimension to the gathering catastrophe. In July 1936, General Francisco Franco launched a military revolt against the elected Spanish Republic, triggering a 3-year civil war that drew in all the major European powers. Germany and Italy intervened on Franco's side, recognizing the war as an opportunity to test new weapons and tactics, to demonstrate the military power of fascism, and to weaken France by establishing a potentially hostile government on its southern flank. The German Condor Legion, a unit of several thousand Luftwaffe personnel operating German aircraft in Spanish skies, learned the techniques of tactical air support, ground attack, and strategic bombing that it would employ so devastatingly in the years ahead. The most notorious single episode of the air war was the bombing of the Basque town of Guernica on April 26, 1937, when Condor Legion aircraft, accompanied by Italian planes, attacked the town on a busy market day, killing several hundred civilians in what was, for its time, an unprecedented assault on a civilian population. The attack was initially denied by the German and Italian governments and by Franco, but the British journalist George Steer, who reached Guernica within hours, filed a detailed eyewitness report that ran in the Times of London and the New York Times and shocked the world. Pablo Picasso, a Spanish artist living in Paris, responded with a massive painting that bears the town's name and became one of the defining images of the 20th century. The Soviet Union intervened on the Republican side, sending out aircraft, tanks, advisors, and political agents, but Stalin's assistance came tangled with requirements for political loyalty to the Communist Party that poisoned the Republican war effort, generating purges, factional fighting, and ultimately contributing to the Republic's defeat. Britain and France adopted a policy of non-intervention, setting up a non-intervention committee that met in London and included representatives of Germany and Italy, who were actively intervening, along with the democracies that genuinely were not. The committee's proceedings were a theatre of bad faith and mutual deception, with Germany and Italy denying their obvious involvement while continuing to pour weapons and men into Franco's armies. The Spanish Civil War ended in April 1939 with Franco's victory. Its importance for the origins of the Second World War lies in several directions. It provided Germany and Italy with invaluable operational experience and demonstrated the capabilities of their new weapons systems. It deepened the polarization between fascism and communism across Europe, making it harder for the Western democracies to build the alliances against Germany that they desperately needed, because any alliance with the Soviet Union looked to conservatives like siding with communism. It demonstrated again and again the pattern that was becoming the decade's defining feature. The fascist powers would act, take risks, and back them with force while the democracies hesitated, deliberated, and ultimately accommodated. By 1937 and into 1938, the pace of events was accelerating toward a crisis that thinking people could see coming, but that few could see how to prevent. Hitler had completed the transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state in which his word was absolute law. The Nazi state had constructed a system of racial persecution through a series of legal measures, of which the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 were the most significant, stripping Jews of German citizenship, prohibiting marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and beginning the systematic exclusion of Jewish people from German economic, professional, and cultural life. In November 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, saw Nazi paramilitaries attack Jewish businesses, synagogues and homes across Germany and Austria, killing at least 91 people, arresting 30,000 Jewish men and sending them to concentration camps, and destroying synagogues on a massive scale. This was no longer persecution conducted through bureaucratic legal mechanisms. It was open, violent public terror, and the world saw it. Some governments protested. No government acted. In February 1938, Hitler moved to remove the last significant institutional check on his military adventurism, using manufactured scandals to force out the conservative military commanders who had occasionally expressed caution about his more reckless plans. He dismissed Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg as defense minister and removed General Werner von Fritsch as army commander-in-chief, both on trumped-up charges. He then reorganized the command structure, creating the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, with himself as supreme commander of all German armed forces. He no longer had to negotiate with generals who might resist his more extreme plans. He was now the unchallenged military as well as political chief of Germany, and he intended to use that power. Austria was the first item on Hitler's territorial agenda. Austria had been politically troubled for years, its government oscillating between the authoritarian Catholic nationalism of the Fatherland Front and pressure from an increasingly aggressive local Nazi movement, receiving support and direction from Berlin. On February 12, 1938, Hitler summoned Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden and subjected him to a lengthy humiliation, making demands backed by implicit threats of military action if they were not met. Hitler wanted Austrian Nazis brought into the Austrian government in key ministerial positions and wanted Austria to align its foreign policy with Germany's. Schuschnigg, a courageous but isolated man, returned to Vienna and in a last desperate gamble announced a plebiscite on Austrian independence to be held on March 13, 1938. He calculated that Austrians, given a genuine free choice, would vote to remain independent. Hitler could not allow a genuine plebiscite to take place because it might well have shown that even many Austrian sympathizers with pan-Germanism did not want a forced absorption into Nazi Germany. He demanded that the plebiscite be cancelled and that Schuschnigg resign in favour of the Austrian Nazi Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Abandoned by Britain and France, who made clear they would not intervene, and without any credible means of military resistance against the vastly larger German forces massed on the border, Schuschnigg resigned with quiet dignity, saying he did not wish to spill German blood and wished the Austrian people good luck. On the morning of March 12, 1938, German forces crossed the Austrian border in Operation Otto. They met no resistance. Hitler himself followed, entering his hometown of Linz to scenes of genuine popular enthusiasm that appeared to surprise even him. On March 13th, the Anschluss was formally proclaimed, and Austria ceased to exist as an independent state, becoming the Ostmark, an eastern province of the German Reich. Germany had been increased in area by 17% and in population by over 6 million people. The Western powers protested and did nothing. Mussolini, who had moved troops to the Brenner Pass to prevent just this development in 1934, this time gave his blessing. Hitler reportedly called the Italian dictator to thank him personally. The strategic consequences for Central Europe were immediate and severe. Czechoslovakia was now surrounded on 3 sides by Germany, and its position, already precarious, had become deeply exposed. Czechoslovakia in 1938 was in many ways the brightest example of what the post-Versailles order had been trying to create: a genuine democracy with an independent judiciary, a free press, functioning trade unions, and a genuinely pluralistic political culture. It was also a modern industrial state with important arms industries, including the Skoda works, which were among the most productive in Europe. Its army, while smaller than Germany's, was well-trained, well-equipped, and had prepared extensive fortifications in the Sudetenland Mountains. It had mutual assistance treaties with both France and the Soviet Union. On paper, it was a defensible country with powerful allies. In practice, it was about to be sacrificed by those allies on the altar of appeasement. The Sudetenland, the mountainous border region of Bohemia and Moravia, contained approximately 3 million German-speaking people, the I. Sudeten Germans who had never been part of Germany but had lived under Habsburg rule for centuries. Their political leader, Konrad Henlein, was receiving detailed instructions and substantial funding from Berlin, and had been personally briefed by Hitler on his strategy. Make demands on the Czechoslovak government that are designed to be refused, escalate, and provide the pretext for German intervention. In April 1938, Henlein's party adopted the Carlsbad Decrees, demanding full autonomy for the Sudetenland and the right to align with Germany's Nazi ideology. The Czechoslovak government, led by President Edvard Beneš, a highly skilled diplomat and political tactician, offered successive and increasingly generous concessions, at one point offering terms that observers noted would have given Henlein almost everything in his program if Henlein's real goal had been autonomy rather than dissolution. But his real goal was dissolution, and no concession was ever enough. Through the summer of 1938, Hitler made a series of violently threatening speeches about the suffering of Sudeten Germans under Czech oppression, and German military preparations for an attack on Czechoslovakia, codenamed Fall Grün or Case Green, were accelerated. The Czech military mobilized in May 1938 when false reports circulated of imminent German military moves. This mobilization, and the apparent Western backing that followed, temporarily checked Hitler's plans and briefly humiliated him, feeding his determination to crush Czechoslovakia. By September, Europe seemed to be sliding toward war. Germany was preparing to invade. France had treaty obligations to Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union had offered to honor its treaty obligations if France did so. Britain was uncertain and anxious. Chamberlain decided to fly personally to Germany. The 3 flights that Neville Chamberlain made to Germany in September 1938, the first time the 69-year-old Prime Minister had ever flown, became the defining acts of his premiership and his legacy. On September 15th, Chamberlain flew to Berchtesgaden, where Hitler received him in his mountain retreat and told him bluntly that he demanded the Sudetenland and was prepared to risk world war to get it. Chamberlain, shaken but resolute in his determination to prevent war, flew home and worked with the French to produce a proposal demanding that all areas of Czechoslovakia with more than 50% German population be ceded to Germany. On September 19th, this demand was presented to the Czechoslovak government. Beneš, in anguish, resisted, then capitulated when Britain and France made clear that if Czechoslovakia rejected the proposal and went to war with Germany, it would do so without Allied support. Having accepted the terms, Czechoslovakia discovered they were not enough. When Chamberlain flew back to Germany on September 22nd, meeting Hitler at the spa town of Bad Godesberg, he found that the stakes had been raised. Hitler now demanded immediate military occupation of the Sudetenland by October 1st, with no orderly transfer process, no protection for the evacuating population, and he tabled new demands from Poland and Hungary that also wanted slices of Czechoslovak territory. Chamberlain returned to London with his framework for settlement in ruins, telling the cabinet that Hitler had seemed determined to have war. For a few days in late September 1938, war seemed genuinely imminent. The British Navy was mobilised. Air raid trenches were dug in London's parks. 38 million gas masks were distributed to British civilians. And then, at the last moment, Mussolini intervened at British, urging to propose a 4-power conference. And Hitler, who may not have been entirely ready for a major war in September 1938, despite his threats, accepted. The Munich Conference of September 29th to 30th, 1938 was the low point of European democracy in the entire interwar period. 4 leaders sat around a table, Chamberlain, Daladier of France, Hitler and Mussolini, and decided the fate of a country that had no representative in the room. Czechoslovakia was told what had been decided and informed that if it rejected the terms, it would face Germany alone. The Soviet Union, which had offered to participate in a defence of Czechoslovakia and which had treaty obligations at least as clear as France's, was not invited and was not consulted. The terms gave Germany the Sudetenland and its fortifications, its industrial plants, and the mountain passes that formed Czechoslovakia's natural defensive line in exchange for German and Italian guarantees of the remaining Czech borders and an Anglo-German declaration of intent to resolve future disputes through consultation. Chamberlain returned to London holding that document, alighted from his aircraft at Heston Aerodrome, and read it to the waiting crowd, describing it as the symbol of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again, and later that evening at 10 Downing Street, leaned from a window and told the cheering crowd that he believed it was peace for our time. Hitler himself expressed contempt for the ease of it. He had expected a fight. He had wanted a military campaign against Czechoslovakia that would demonstrate Germany's power. Instead, he had been denied his war by Chamberlain's insistence on negotiation, and though he had gained the Sudetenland, he felt cheated of the military triumph and the further dismemberment of Czechoslovakia that had been his actual goal. He reportedly told his military commanders that he had been robbed by that damned umbrella-carrying old fellow, referring to Chamberlain's signature umbrella. This attitude reveals something crucial. Munich did not satisfy Hitler. It taught him that the democracies would retreat further under pressure, that escalating demands and military threats produced concessions, and that a determined man with a willingness to use force could take almost anything he wanted from the frightened leaders of the Western world. Within 6 months, Munich was exposed as the illusion it had always been. On March 15, 1939, German forces entered what remained of Czechoslovakia and occupied it without resistance. The Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia became a German protectorate. Slovakia, under German pressure, declared nominal independence as a German puppet state. Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. This was fundamentally different from everything that had gone before. The annexation of Austria could be justified, however strained the reasoning, by the principle of self-determination. Austrians were German speakers. The Sudetenland could be similarly justified. But the Czech lands had no German-speaking population to speak of. This was raw conquest, the absorption of a non-German people against their will, and it shattered the central premise of Chamberlain's policy, which had been that Hitler was a nationalist leader seeking to incorporate German populations into Germany, not a conqueror seeking to dominate Europe. The occupation of Prague revealed that premise as fiction. Chamberlain was publicly humiliated and genuinely furious. In a speech in Birmingham on March 17, 1939, he asked rhetorically whether this German move was the last attack upon a small state, or whether it was to be followed by others, and whether, in fact, this was not a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force. The answer to his question was obvious. The reversal of British policy came with remarkable speed. On March 31, 1939, Britain gave Poland a unilateral guarantee. If Poland were attacked by Germany, Britain would come to its assistance. France followed with a similar commitment. After years of refusing to make binding commitments to Eastern European states, the democracies had now committed themselves to defending a country they had no practical ability to help directly, and had done so without securing the Soviet alliance that would have made the guarantee militarily meaningful. The Polish guarantee was a moral statement as much as a strategic calculation. It was Britain and France saying that they had gone as far as they would go, that the next act of German aggression would mean war. But the strategic problem was gaping. Poland had a long border with Germany and was potentially vulnerable on multiple sides. British and French forces had no route to Poland. They shared no border with it. The only power that could actually place troops on Germany's eastern flank was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had not been consulted about the Polish guarantee and was not included in it. The Anglo-French negotiations with the Soviet Union for a collective security arrangement that began in April 1939 and continued desultorily through the summer were a dismal failure of diplomacy, characterized by Western hesitancy, Soviet impatience, and irreconcilable contradictions that nobody had the political will to resolve. The Soviets wanted a comprehensive security arrangement that would allow Soviet forces to enter the Baltic states and Poland automatically in the event of German aggression, regardless of whether those states requested assistance. This was, from a purely military standpoint, a reasonable demand. German forces could not be stopped at the Soviet border if they were already through Poland and the Baltic states. But Poland refused categorically to allow Soviet troops on Polish soil, and the Baltic states were equally resistant. The memory of Russian imperial domination was too fresh and too bitter. British and French diplomats, unwilling to force the issue with the Poles, allowed the negotiations to drag through the summer without resolution, sending delegations of insufficient seniority to signal their seriousness, discussing procedural questions when they should have been resolving fundamental ones, and generally behaving as if they had all the time in the world when they manifestly did not. Stalin, watching the negotiations stall, reached his own conclusions. If Britain and France would not conclude a genuine military alliance with the Soviet Union, if they were not serious about collective resistance to Germany, then the Soviet Union would have to seek its own security by other means. And the most immediate and certain means available was a deal with Germany itself. The thought of a Nazi-Soviet pact seemed almost impossibly paradoxical to outside observers, given the ideological gulf between the two systems. But neither Hitler nor Stalin was bound by ideological consistency when strategic interests were at stake. Hitler needed the Soviet Union's neutrality before he moved against Poland. Stalin needed time, buffer territory, and the assurance that any war between Germany and the Western democracies would not immediately involve the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1939, secret contacts were established between Berlin and Moscow. Ribbentrop flew to Moscow on August 23rd and signed with Molotov, in the presence of a visibly pleased Stalin, the German-Soviet non-aggression treaty. The public terms committed both countries to neutrality if either was attacked by a third party and to mutual non-aggression. The secret protocol, which Soviet authorities denied existed until 1989, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence with chilling precision. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Eastern Poland fell to the Soviet sphere. Western Poland fell to Germany. The Baltic states would be occupied by the Soviet Union. Eastern Poland would become a Soviet sphere, to be occupied when Germany attacked from the west. Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in Romania would also be Soviet. It was a partition of Eastern Europe between two totalitarian powers, executed with the bureaucratic precision of a real estate transaction. The news of the pact, announced on the morning of August 24th, fell on European capitals like a thunderbolt. It meant that Germany could attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. It meant that the deterrence framework that Britain and France had been trying to construct was shattered. It meant that war, which had seemed like a possibility, had become a near certainty. Britain and France scrambled to signal their resolve, confirming the Polish guarantee and warning Germany that they would honour their commitments. Hitler dismissed these warnings, telling his generals that they were worms and would not fight. The final preparations for war were made in the last days of August 1939. Hitler issued a series of escalating demands regarding Danzig and the Polish corridor, demands that were designed not to be accepted, but to provide the appearance of a negotiating process that Poland had supposedly refused. Poland, under the guidance of its foreign minister Józef Beck and its commander-in-chief Edward Rydz-Śmigły, refused to submit to ultimatums delivered under military threat. It would not do what Czechoslovakia had done. On the night of August 31st, SS troops dressed in Polish uniforms staged a faked attack on the German radio station at Gliwice, near the Polish border, as Hitler had ordered. German concentration camp prisoners, given Polish uniforms before being executed, were left at the scene as alleged Polish casualties. The pretext, transparent to any objective observer, was in place. At 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border on multiple fronts. The Wehrmacht's armoured and motorised divisions applying in full measure the operational concepts of deep, fast, combined arms warfare that would be called blitzkrieg, drove into Polish territory from the north from East Prussia, from the west from Pomerania and Silesia, and from the south from Slovakia. The Luftwaffe bombed Polish airfields, communications networks and cities. The old battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in Danzig harbour on what had been described as a courtesy visit, opened fire on the small Polish military garrison at the Westerplatte at the same moment, beginning a battle that the outnumbered Polish defenders would sustain with extraordinary courage for 7 days. Warsaw received air raids within hours. The Second World War had begun. Britain delivered its ultimatum to Germany at 9 in the morning on September 3rd, demanding that Germany withdraw its forces from Poland. No reply came. At 11:15 in the morning, in a BBC radio broadcast, Neville Chamberlain told the British people that no such undertaking had been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. His voice was tired, sad and strained. The voice of a man who had genuinely believed that war could be avoided and had discovered that he had been wrong. France declared war a few hours later. The world was at war. Poland was conquered quickly. Soviet forces invaded from the east on September 17th, in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop secret protocol. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th. The last Polish resistance ended on October 6th. In 5 weeks, a nation of 35 million people had been overrun by two great powers acting in coordination. But the war that those 5 weeks launched would ultimately consume the power and the societies of both of Poland's destroyers, along with much of the rest of the world, before it ended 6 terrible years later. What really started the Second World War? Having walked through the entire sequence from the Treaty of Versailles to the fields of Poland, we can now attempt an honest answer. And the honest answer is that there was no single cause. The war was the product of a chain of causes stretching back at least to 1919 and, in some respects, much further, with each link in the chain reinforcing and enabling the next. The Treaty of Versailles created the conditions. The humiliation, the economic devastation, the denial of self-determination in some cases, while applying it selectively in others, the war guilt clause that assigned exclusive blame without basis in fact. These conditions made radical nationalism not just possible, but politically powerful in a democracy under severe strain. The Great Depression provided the crisis that turned political possibility into electoral reality, driving millions of desperate Germans toward the most extreme solution on offer. The failures of the Weimar Republic, the structural weaknesses of a young democracy operating under conditions of near impossible difficulty, created the institutional vacuum that Hitler exploited. The mistakes of conservative German politicians who thought they could contain Hitler allowed him into the machinery of the state, and then the failures of the international community allowed him to use that machinery without effective challenge for 6 years. The failures of Britain and France were real and consequential. The policy of appeasement, however understandable in its origins and however much it might be explained by the genuine desire to avoid another catastrophic war, ultimately enabled Hitler by teaching him that the democracies would not resist. Each concession, each unanswered violation of Versailles, each retreat in the face of escalating demands made the next step easier and bolder. The failure to build an effective alliance against Germany, including the failure to bring the Soviet Union in on terms that might have created a genuine deterrent, was a strategic error of the first magnitude, however difficult the alternatives were. The inability of the League of Nations to enforce collective security, demonstrated in Manchuria and confirmed in Ethiopia and Spain, eliminated the institutional framework within which aggressive states might have been checked. But in the end, the war happened because one man willed it. Adolf Hitler did not stumble into the Second World War. He had been planning for it since the early 1920s, had outlined its ideological foundations in Mein Kampf, and had spent the years of his power systematically building toward it. He was not an impersonal force of historical circumstance. He was a specific individual who made specific choices at specific moments, and without him it is genuinely difficult to imagine how a Second World War breaks out in 1939 from the conditions then prevailing. Other German nationalists might have sought to revise Versailles. None of the alternatives would have pursued the program of racial genocide and continental conquest that was Hitler's actual goal and that made the war both inevitable and uniquely terrible. The responsibility for the Second World War rests above all and without serious historical debate on Adolf Hitler and the movement he led. Understanding how he was able to make those choices, how he was able to build the power and the geopolitical position from which he launched his war, requires understanding everything that preceded him. The story of 1918 to 1939 is ultimately a story of how free societies can fail, how economic desperation can open the door to demagogy, how the desire to avoid conflict can create the conditions that make conflict inevitable, and how the international community's failure to act on shared principles of justice and collective security can produce consequences infinitely worse than the costs of action would have been. These are not lessons of merely historical interest. They are warnings as relevant today as they were in the 20th century, about the fragility of democratic institutions under stress, about the dangers of appeasement masquerading as prudence, and about the price of discovering too late that there are things worth fighting for before the choice to fight on favourable terms has been taken away. The guns of September 1939 did not fire from nowhere. They were fired by a man who had learned step by step and lesson by lesson over 6 years that the world would not stop him. And they were. Enabled by a generation of choices from the conference tables of Paris in 1919 to the cheering crowds outside 10 Downing Street in September 1938, that added up, taken together, to one of the greatest failures of political judgment in modern history. Understanding those choices, understanding why intelligent, well-meaning people made them, and understanding what they led to is not just an academic exercise. It is an essential part of the inheritance that history passes to those who come after, and an argument for taking that inheritance seriously. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. The causes of the Second World War stretch across 2 extraordinary decades of crisis, transformation, and missed opportunity. And the more closely you look at that period, the more you understand both why things happened as they did and how different choices might have changed everything. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what really happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II, as well as our video exploring what German generals thought of the Allied commanders they faced. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all of our World War II content. See you in the next one. To fully understand what started the Second World War, we must look more closely at several threads that run through the entire period from 1919 to 1939, and that any complete account must address. We have traced the broad arc, but history lives in its details, and the details of these 2 decades are rich with personalities, decisions, and turning points that reward closer examination. Let us go back and examine some of the most important. The figure of Neville Chamberlain deserves more than a single-dimensional portrait as the architect of appeasement. He was born in 1869 into one of the most distinguished political families in Britain. His father, Joseph Chamberlain, had been one of the dominant figures in late Victorian politics, and his half-brother Austin had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in negotiating the Locarno Treaties in 1925. Neville himself was a man of considerable administrative ability, who had been a highly effective Lord Mayor of Birmingham and an energetic Minister of Health before becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Prime Minister in May 1937. He came to the premiership at the age of 68 with a confidence in his own judgment, a businessman's impatience with diplomatic vagueness, and a genuine moral conviction that war was an absolute evil that must be avoided if humanly possible. He was not a coward. He was not stupid, and he was not, as his critics sometimes implied, simply naive about the nature of Nazi Germany. What Chamberlain fundamentally believed and clung to, despite accumulating evidence to the contrary, was that Hitler was a rational actor with identifiable, satisfiable demands, and that a skilled and determined negotiator could identify those demands and meet them in exchange for peace. He also genuinely believed, and this was not entirely wrong, that Britain was not militarily ready to fight Germany in 1938, that the RAF and the British Army needed more time to absorb the results of the rearmament programme that had been underway since 1936, and that a year or 2 of peace bought at almost any price was worth having. The tragedy of Chamberlain's position is that both of these calculations had genuine merit, but were fatally undermined by a single incorrect premise, that Hitler's demands were finite. They were not. Hitler did not have a list of specific grievances that could be addressed and checked off. He had a program for continental domination that would always generate new demands once old ones were satisfied. The very act of satisfaction told him that more was available. Chamberlain was essentially trying to fill a bucket that had no bottom. There were voices in Britain who understood this. Winston Churchill, the Conservative backbencher who had been out of government since 1929, had been warning throughout the decade about the danger of German rearmament and the inadequacy of British responses to it. In the House of Commons on October 5, 1938, 5 days after the Munich Agreement was signed to popular acclaim, Churchill delivered what many historians regard as one of the finest parliamentary speeches of the 20th century. He told the House of Commons that they had sustained a total and unmitigated defeat, that all was over, and that silent, mournful, abandoned, broken Czechoslovakia receded into the darkness. He warned that this was not the end, that it was only the beginning of the reckoning, and that the whole equilibrium of Europe had been deranged and the terrible words had for the time being been pronounced against the Western democracies. Churchill was denounced by the government. benches as a warmonger, an alarmist, a man whose judgment had been consistently wrong. He was heckled and jeered, but his analysis, as subsequent events within 6 months would demonstrate, was entirely correct. His problem was that he was right too early, before events had taught the wider public what he could already see. Anthony Eden, the handsome and capable Foreign Secretary whom Chamberlain had appointed in 1935, resigned in February 1938 over what he regarded as Chamberlain's excessive willingness to make bilateral deals with Mussolini and over the Prime Minister's habit of conducting foreign policy without proper consultation of the Foreign Office. The resignation of a 40-year-old cabinet minister who was regarded as one of the brightest stars in the Conservative Party was a significant blow and attracted considerable public attention. Eden gave only measured public criticism of the government after his resignation, but his departure removed from the cabinet the one minister most likely to argue effectively for a firmer line. Chamberlain, after Eden's departure, effectively became his own foreign secretary, dealing directly with Hitler and Mussolini through personal representatives and channels that bypassed the professional diplomatic establishment. The French Premier Édouard Daladier, who signed the Munich Agreement alongside Chamberlain, had no illusions about what he had done. When his aircraft landed at Le Bourget Airport in Paris after the Munich conference and he saw the vast crowd waiting for him, he reportedly turned to an aide and said something like, "The fools. They don't know what they're cheering for." He expected to be denounced for having betrayed France's treaty obligations to Czechoslovakia and sold a democratic ally to its destroyer. Instead, the crowd cheered him. The relief at the avoidance of war was so enormous that even a peace achieved through the abandonment of an ally was celebrated. Daladier signed Munich knowing it was wrong, believing France had no choice without British military support, and despising himself for it. His account illuminates something important about the Munich capitulation. It was not simply the product of men who did not understand the danger, it was also the product of men who understood the danger perfectly well, but calculated that the immediate cost of resistance was higher than they or their societies could bear. They were wrong. But their mistake was not simply ignorance, it was a miscalculation about relative costs whose full extent only became clear in retrospect. The role of the German military in the events leading to war is more complex than a simple narrative of soldiers obeying a criminal regime might suggest. Throughout the mid-1930s, there were genuine military professionals within the Wehrmacht who harboured doubts about Hitler's more reckless strategic gambles and who feared that Germany was being led toward a war it was not yet prepared to win. The chief for the German General Staff, Ludwig Beck, was one of the most significant of these. Beck was a cautious and methodical military professional who believed that Germany's strategic situation did not support the kind of aggressive, unilateral action Hitler was planning. In the summer of 1938, during the Sudeten crisis, Beck wrote a series of memoranda arguing that an attack on Czechoslovakia would inevitably bring France, Britain, and probably the Soviet Union into the war, and that Germany would lose such a conflict. When Hitler dismissed his arguments, Beck resigned his position in August 1938. The only senior German officer to resign on grounds of moral and strategic principle during the entire Nazi period. He would later participate in the July 1944 bomb plot against Hitler and died on that day either by his own hand or executed by the SS. The accounts differ. Beck's successor as Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, was also deeply skeptical of Hitler's war plans in the autumn of 1938 and was involved in a plot among senior military officers and some conservative civilians to arrest Hitler if he actually launched a war against Czechoslovakia. The conspirators believed that a general war would be catastrophic for Germany and that Hitler's removal was necessary to prevent it. The plot was serious enough to have had a genuine chance of success, and it fell apart not because it was discovered, but because Chamberlain flew to Germany and negotiated the Munich Agreement, removing the occasion for the coup. The appeasement that Chamberlain intended as a path to peace may thus have had the unintended effect of destroying the best chance of removing Hitler from power before a major war could begin. It is one of the more bitter ironies in a period full of bitter ironies. German society's relationship with the Nazi regime was not simply one of a population in the grip of terror, though terror was certainly present and essential to the regime's functioning. There was also genuine popular support, at least in the years of economic recovery and diplomatic triumph. Germany's unemployment had fallen from over 6 million in early 1932 to virtually zero by 1938. An economic recovery achieved through massive public works programs, rearmament spending, and deficit financing that was genuinely popular because its immediate effects were visible and beneficial to ordinary workers and their families. The Autobahn highway network, begun in 1933, employed tens of thousands and was celebrated as both an economic achievement and a symbol of German modernity. Housing construction boomed. Consumer goods became more widely available. For millions of ordinary Germans who had spent years in economic misery, the early years of the Nazi regime felt like a genuine recovery, and they were inclined to attribute it to their government's competence and strength, rather than to the unsustainable financial engineering that actually underlay it. The 1936 Berlin Olympics provided Hitler with an extraordinary opportunity to project an image of the Nazi regime to the world that was carefully curated to minimize the visible ugliness of Nazi racial policy and maximize the impression of a vigorous, organized, modern, and peaceable Germany. For 2 weeks in August 1936, anti-Semitic signs were taken down in Berlin. The rougher edge of street harassment was suspended, and the Olympic facilities, designed by architect Werner March, presented an image of aesthetic grandeur and organizational competence. The Games were a public relations triumph for the regime. Leni Riefenstahl's documentary film of the Games, Olympia, released in 1938 to international acclaim, reinforced the impression of a new Germany that was dynamic and formidable, but not threatening. Hundreds of foreign visitors, journalists, athletes, and diplomats left Berlin with favorable impressions. The few voices that argued the Games were being used as Nazi propaganda, including those who called for a boycott, were dismissed as political extremists or cranks. The American team, despite internal debates about participation, competed. Jesse Owens, the black American sprinter who won 4 gold medals, became the human story of the Berlin Games, and Hitler's apparent displeasure at Owens's success, whether real or exaggerated by subsequent myth-making, became the symbolic moment that American audiences remembered. But the political reality was that the Games served Hitler's purposes far more than they served his opponents. The Night of the Long Knives in June and July 1934 was an event of enormous importance for understanding the internal dynamics of the Nazi state. In the early morning hours of June 30th, 1934, Hitler moved against the leadership of the SA, the Sturmabteilung or Stormtroopers, the brown-shirted paramilitary organization that had been the street-fighting wing of the Nazi movement, and that was now, under its chief Ernst Röhm, pushing for a second revolution that would subordinate the traditional military to Nazi ideological control. Röhm was a genuine radical who had long argued that the SA should replace the conservative Wehrmacht as Germany's primary military organization. This alarmed the military, which wanted nothing of the sort, and it alarmed conservative elites who feared that the revolutionary energy of the Nazi movement might turn against them. Hitler, needing the support of the military and of Hindenburg, chose to destroy the SA leadership rather than the Wehrmacht. In a series of murders carried out by the SS across Germany over 2 days, Röhm and perhaps as many as 200 other SA leaders, plus other political opponents who the Nazis took the opportunity to settle accounts with, were killed. The operation, sanitized by Hitler in a subsequent Reichstag speech as emergency measures against traitors, was received with relief by the conservative establishment and with apparent equanimity by the German public. Its real significance was in demonstrating that within the Nazi state, power resided with those who could command the loyalty of the SS and Gestapo, and that even long-standing party members were not safe if they became inconvenient. The relationship between the Nazi regime and German industry and finance deserves attention because it complicates the simple narrative of a regime that terrorized its way to power. Major German industrialists and financiers had indeed contributed to Hitler's rise, providing funding and legitimacy at crucial moments. The famous industrialists' petition of November 1932, signed by Hjalmar Schacht and other leading businessmen, urging Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, was one such moment. These men had calculated that Hitler would be useful in suppressing communist and socialist labor movements and in expanding government spending on industry, and they were right on both counts. The rearmament program was enormously profitable for Germany's steel, chemical, and engineering industries. Schacht himself served as Hitler's economics minister and president of the Reichsbank, presiding over the economic recovery with considerable skill before he fell out of favor with the regime in 1937, over his growing concern about the economic unsustainability of rearmament spending. The relationship between German capitalism and Nazism was not one of simple domination in either direction. It was a partnership of mutual benefit in which the capitalists provided resources and legitimacy and received economic benefits and protection from the labor left, while the Nazis received the financing and organizational capacity needed to build the war machine. Both sides understood roughly what they were doing. Neither fully anticipated where it would lead. The persecution of Jews in Germany between 1933 and 1939 escalated in stages that moved from legal discrimination toward open terror in ways that the international community consistently failed to respond to adequately. The initial measures were discriminatory: the April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service of the same month, which removed Jews from government employment, the gradual exclusion of Jews from medicine, law, journalism, and other professions. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, promulgated at the annual Nazi Party rally, stripped Jews of German citizenship, prohibited marriage between Jews and Aryans, and defined Jewishness in racial terms that classified as Jewish anyone with 3 or more Jewish grandparents. These measures, presented in the language of legality and order, created a second class of permanent non-citizens within Germany whose status was fundamentally different from that of other Germans. They were, in practical terms, being prepared for eventual removal from German society, though the mechanism and ultimate form of that removal was still, in 1935, uncertain even within the Nazi leadership. The pogrom of November 9th and 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, represented a qualitative escalation from persecution by law to open physical terror. The pretext was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man, Herschel Grinspan, who was himself a refugee acting in protest at the brutal expulsion of his parents from Germany to Poland. Goebbels used the assassination as the occasion for a coordinated nationwide pogrom. Over 2 nights, SA and SS men, often in plain clothes, attacked Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Approximately 1,400 synagogues were burned. At least 91 Jews were killed directly, and the total death toll was certainly higher. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps at Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, where they endured beatings, forced labor, and deliberate humiliation before being released, generally on condition that they emigrate immediately. The Nazis then fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage done to their own property. The pogrom was reported extensively in the foreign press, and the reaction in many countries was one of horror and condemnation. The American ambassador was recalled from Berlin. Diplomatic protests were lodged, and then, as had happened before, the protests faded and daily life resumed, and the persecution continued. The refugee crisis produced by Nazi persecution confronted the international community with a humanitarian emergency that it handled very poorly. By 1938, hundreds of thousands of German Jews were desperate to leave Germany, but the countries that might have received them, including the United States, Britain, France, and others, imposed strict immigration quotas and created bureaucratic obstacles that prevented most refugees from finding sanctuary. The Evian Conference of July 1938 called specifically to address the refugee problem saw representatives of 32 nations gather at the French resort town for 9 days and produce virtually no meaningful commitments to increased refugee admissions. Most countries expressed sympathy and then explained why they could not increase their intake. The United States, Britain, France, Australia, Canada, and others all declined to significantly raise their immigration quotas. Only tiny countries like Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic offered to take significant numbers, and the Dominican Republic's offer was at least partly motivated by the desire for racial whitening of its population, which is a complicated footnote in itself. The Evian Conference was a moral failure of the First Order, and it was not lost on Nazi planners that the democracies were content to protest German treatment of Jews while declining to provide the Jews anywhere to go. The military balance between Germany and the Western powers in the years leading up to 1939 is essential context for understanding why appeasement seemed rational to some policymakers and why the failure to act earlier was so costly. Germany's rearmament, begun secretly and then accelerated openly after 1935, had by 1938 created a military force of significant capability, though one that was not yet fully prepared for a major war. The Luftwaffe had several thousand modern aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter and the Heinkel He 111 bomber, that were among the best in the world. The Wehrmacht had approximately 100 divisions, of which many were well trained and equipped with modern weaponry. The tank force, while not yet the dominant armoured formations of 1940 and beyond, was capable and growing rapidly. German military doctrine, incorporating the combined arms principles of infantry, armour, artillery and air support working in coordination, was more advanced than that of any comparable power. But Britain and France were also rearming, if more slowly and with less urgency, than Germany. Britain's decision in 1936 to prioritise the RAF, particularly fighters rather than bombers, would prove enormously consequential in 1940. The Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, both beginning production by 1937 and 1938 respectively, were competitive with German equivalents. British radar development, the chain home network being constructed along the southern and eastern coasts of England, was further advanced than any German equivalent. France had substantial armoured forces and many more tanks than Germany in 1939, though their doctrine was inferior. The combined Anglo-French military potential in 1938 was probably not decisively inferior to Germany's, and the addition of Czechoslovakia's 35 well-trained divisions and formidable fortifications to the Allied side would have created a much more favourable balance. The argument that Munich was necessary because the democracies could not fight Germany in 1938 is not supported by the military evidence as clearly as Chamberlain's defenders suggest. The Polish crisis in the summer of 1939 played out against this background of Anglo-French guarantees that lacked strategic credibility without Soviet participation. The Polish government, led by Foreign Minister Józef Beck, was navigating an extraordinarily difficult position between two aggressive great powers. Poland's relationship with the Soviet Union was almost as hostile as its relationship with Germany, based on centuries of conflict and the very recent Soviet invasion of Poland during the Russo-Polish War of 1919 to 1921, in which the Red Army had been driven back from the gates of Warsaw. The Poles had no more desire to have Soviet forces on their territory than they had to see German forces there, and their refusal to permit Soviet transit rights was not simple stubbornness, but a rational, if ultimately fatal, calculation about their national survival. The Polish military preparations in the months before the German attack were serious and well executed within the constraints of Polish resources. The Polish army mobilized approximately 1 million men and deployed them on a defensive perimeter that was spread too widely given the threat from multiple directions, partly because of Polish political decisions about protecting industrial regions, and partly because the army command expected to fight a relatively conventional defensive battle rather than the rapid, deep, combined arms offensive that Germany actually unleashed. The Polish Air Force, though qualitatively inferior to the Luftwaffe and numerically vastly outnumbered, dispersed its aircraft from main airfields before the attack and survived longer than German planners expected. The myth that the Polish cavalry charged German tanks with lances, which has sometimes been used to characterize Polish military conduct as antiquated and futile, is largely just that, a myth. Polish cavalry did encounter German armour on a few occasions, using the traditional cavalry technique of mounted infantry, and in some instances suffered badly, but the Polish army fought with considerable effectiveness against overwhelming odds and inflicted significant casualties on the German forces. The Germans lost approximately 44,000 men killed, wounded, and missing in the Polish campaign, a significant number that belied any notion that Poland was an easy conquest. The military campaign against Poland established the operational template for German operations in the first 2 years of the war. Fall Weiss, the German operational plan, called for 3 simultaneous thrusts into Poland from different directions, designed to prevent the Polish army from organizing a coherent defense or retreating eastward to a shorter, more defensible line. Army Group North, under General Fedor von Bock, attacked from Pomerania and East Prussia. Army Group South, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, attacked from Silesia and Slovakia. The Luftwaffe ranged over the entire country, hitting airfields, road junctions, railway stations, and military communications in the opening hours, and disrupting Polish mobilization and command. Warsaw was bombed heavily. causing significant civilian casualties. The entire concept of operations was designed around speed, shock, and the paralysis of the defender's ability to respond coherently, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. Within a week, Polish forces were fighting in isolated pockets without coherent communications or resupply. Within 2 weeks, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Soviet invasion on September 17th, which struck from the east when Polish forces were already fully committed against Germany, eliminated any remaining possibility of organized resistance. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland on September 17th, 1939, proceeding smoothly against minimal resistance, resulted in the Soviet annexation of approximately 193,000 square kilometers of Polish territory, with a population of over 13 million people, including large Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, as well as significant numbers of Poles, Jews, and others. The Soviet occupation regime was immediately brutal, beginning an organized campaign of arrests, deportations, and executions directed against the Polish state and military apparatus. Soviet forces killed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in the Katyn massacre and related operations in the spring of 1940, a crime that the Soviet Union denied for 50 years and only acknowledged in 1990. Poland thus suffered simultaneously at the hands of both powers between whom it had been partitioned, and the question of which occupation was worse is not one that has a simple or comfortable answer. The response of Britain and France to the German invasion of Poland illustrated the painful gap between their political commitments and their military capabilities. They had guaranteed Poland, and they honoured that commitment, declaring war on September 3rd. But they could do almost nothing to help Poland directly. France had mobilised and had approximately 40 French divisions facing Germany's western fortifications, known as the West Wall or Siegfried Line, which was held by relatively weak German forces because the bulk of the Wehrmacht was engaged in Poland. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, launched a limited offensive into the Saar region in mid-September, the Saar offensive advancing a few kilometres into Germany before halting and eventually withdrawing. This limited probe, dictated by French caution and the fear of casualties on unfavourable terrain, did nothing to relieve the pressure on Poland. It demonstrated that France's enormous mobilised strength was shackled by a defensive mentality and an operational doctrine that made it effectively incapable of the rapid, aggressive action that might have exploited Germany's temporary weakness in the West. The opportunity passed. Poland fell, and the so-called phony war settled over the Western Front, a period of almost 8 months of inactivity, during which Germany consolidated its gains in the East, rested and resupplied, and planned the campaign in the West that would, in May 1940, bring France to its knees in 6 weeks. One more crucial element deserves exploration before we conclude this comprehensive survey of the origins of the Second World War, and that is the role of ideology. The war was not merely a conflict between states or between national interests, as earlier European wars had been. It was also an ideological war, a clash between totalitarian visions of the future and the democratic values that, however imperfectly realized, the Western powers embodied and claimed to defend. Hitler's ideological program, as laid out in Mein Kampf and refined through the years of his rise and consolidation, was not primarily about national self-determination or even about the revision of Versailles, though both of these provided convenient slogans. It was about racial hierarchy, about the creation of a German racial empire in the East through the conquest and colonization of Slavic territories, and about the elimination of what he regarded as racial pollution, above all the Jewish people. These goals required war. They could not be achieved by diplomacy because no diplomatic settlement could deliver to Germany the subjugation of Eastern Europe and the elimination of the Jewish population of the continent. War was not a means to achieve Hitler's ends. War was itself one of his ends, the crucible in which the new racial order would be forged. This ideological dimension explains why the Second World War could not have been prevented once Hitler was in a position to start it, except by his removal from power. The appeasers were not simply wrong about Hitler's demands being satisfiable. They were wrong about the fundamental nature of what he was trying to achieve. The war was not about Danzig, it was never about Danzig. Danzig was a pretext, a convenient flashpoint that provided the occasion for a conflict that Hitler had been preparing for years. Once one understands this, the entire history of the 1930s reads differently. Every concession was not an opportunity for settlement, but an encouragement to further demands. Every demonstration of Allied weakness was not a reason for Hitler to moderate his goals, but a reason to pursue them more boldly. The only language that Hitler understood or respected was force, and the tragic arc of the decade from 1930 to 1939 is the story of a world that did not speak that language firmly enough, clearly enough, or early enough to prevent the catastrophe that followed. The historians have debated for decades whether there was a single point at which the war could most effectively have been prevented. Some argue that the moment was in 1933, when the Western powers should have confronted the Nazi regime. In its infancy, before it had consolidated power internally, and before German rearmament had proceeded far enough to make military pressure costly. Others argue that 1936, the Rhineland, was the decisive moment, when a French military response to German remilitarization would have reversed the gamble at minimal cost and might, given the fragility of Hitler's internal position at that stage, have destabilized the regime. Still others point to 1938, the Munich moment, arguing that even with the Sudetenland sacrificed, the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 should have triggered immediate military action rather than guarantees to Poland. Each of these arguments has merit, and the common thread running through all of them is that earlier action would have been cheaper, and that the cost of confronting Hitler grew with every year that passed and every concession that was made. What is less debated is the conclusion. By September 1939, there was no longer any alternative to war. Hitler had accumulated too much territory, built too powerful a military force, and demonstrated too clearly his willingness to use it for diplomacy to offer any further prospect of containing him. The war that Britain and France finally fought in September 1939 was a harder, longer, and costlier war than it needed to have been, in part because they had waited too long, and in part because the ally they needed most, the Soviet Union, had been driven by their own failures of diplomacy into a temporary partnership with the enemy. The Soviet Union would of course eventually fight Germany when Hitler invaded it in June 1941, and ultimately bear the largest share of the burden and the casualties of defeating Nazi Germany. But the path to that conclusion ran through 3 years of catastrophe and tens of millions of deaths that might, in different circumstances, have been avoided. The world that emerged from the Second World War in 1945 was one that had been permanently scarred by the preceding 6 years. But it was also a world that had learned something, imperfectly and at terrible cost, about the dangers of the failures that had made the war possible. The United Nations was created with the lessons of the League of Nations failure in mind. The Marshall Plan was a deliberate attempt to avoid repeating the economic disasters of the Versailles peace by rebuilding rather than punishing the defeated nations. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that individuals could be held criminally responsible for wars of aggression and crimes against humanity. The European integration project, beginning with the coal and steel community in 1951 and eventually developing into the European Union, was explicitly designed to make the economic and political interdependence between France and Germany so deep that war between them became unthinkable. These were all attempts to address the specific failures, the economic injustices, the institutional gaps, the absence of accountability that had allowed the road from 1919 to 1939 to end where it did. They were imperfect attempts, as all human institutions are imperfect, but they reflected a genuine learning from history, a determination not to repeat the mistakes that had cost so much. Whether those lessons have been permanently absorbed, whether the knowledge of what caused the Second World War remains alive and relevant as the generation that lived through it passes from the scene, is a question that each generation must answer for itself. History does not repeat itself automatically, but it does, as has often been observed, rhyme. The conditions that produced the catastrophe of 1939, economic despair, political polarization, the rise of demagogues who offered simple answers to complex problems, the failure of international institutions, the temptation to accommodate threats rather than confront them, are not unique to that era. They are features of political life that recur in different forms, and recognizing them for what they are requires knowing the history of what they have produced before.